65 million years ago, a massive and catastrophic event, generally considered to be an asteroid impact, brought about the extinction of the dinosaurs. There is scientific debate surrounding the cause of the extinction event itself, but the sudden and dramatic demise of most living creatures on the planet after 175 million years is broadly agreed. Are we likely to experience another such event that would once again recalibrate life on Earth? Or do we have a silent protector in the form of the planet Jupiter? Well, to talk more about this, we're joined by JONTI Horner, Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Southern Queensland. Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, Professor, you've done some very specific and fascinating research on Jupiter. And in fact, is Jupiter our protector or is it a foe?
It's one of those stories where it's a little bit more complicated than either. And it's a really interesting one because I grew up watching awesome documentaries and they always trotted out this line that Jupiter was a shield. It protected the Earth from impacts. And without Jupiter, we wouldn't be here. The Earth would be pummeled into oblivion, essentially. And through the course of my career, that's just something that niggled at me a bit. So I moved to work at the Open University in the UK more than a decade ago now, and was working there with a very dear friend and collaborator of mine, Professor Barry Jones, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And he too had this niggling suspicion that the story might be a bit more complicated. Now, the simple idea is that Jupiter's floating around out there, things hit it instead of us, and so they're removed and they can't go on to hit us. But also that Jupiter has a habit of grabbing things and throwing them away, getting them out of the solar system never to return, and therefore, once again, preventing them from coming repeatedly past the Earth and posing a threat. But the flip side of the story is that if you look at where the Earth is in the solar system, most of the debris that crosses Earth's orbit, most of the things that could cause impacts like the one that helped kill the dinosaurs, are put there by Jupiter. Jupiter slings them our way. So it's neither really just simply a friend clearing things up or a foe throwing things our way, but the balance comes down to whether it's more effective at dealing damage to us, sending things towards us, or whether it's more effective at cleaning up after itself. It's one of those stories that gets more complicated the deeper you look into it, essentially.
So part of your research has been looking at Comet Lexil, which is a particularly interesting story. Can you give our viewers a sense of this particular story? Because it really does show how complex the role is that Jupiter plays, as you've just been describing.
It does, and Comet Lexil's been kind of a touchstone for me all the way through this work because it illustrates this kind of two-faced nature of Jupiter really beautifully. Lexil's comet was discovered by Charles Messier, who's a very famous astronomer, back in the year 1770. On the 1st of June, I think it was. And at that time, it was a little bit of a faint fuzzy blob, and Messier made a whole industry of finding faint fuzzy blobs in the sky, which is why we have the Messier catalogue, named after him, that catalogues some of the most spectacular things. He found this object on 1st of July, and within a fortnight, it was as bright as the brightest stars, but it didn't look like any comet anybody had ever seen. It was much bigger in the sky, very diffuse, and also moving much more rapidly across the night sky than comets people normally saw. Now, comets don't streak across the sky like they do in popular culture, but rather they move very slowly because they are further away than the moon, significantly further away. What people realised really quickly with Comet Lexil was that it had come very close to the Earth, and it was, and still is, the closest approach by a comet in recorded history. It was still well beyond the moon, but it was much closer, and that was why its movement appeared to be so much faster, because it was close in. It appeared to move quicker across the sky. The other thing that people realised really quickly was that this very bright comet, that was visible even from the centre of the biggest cities, was going around the sun roughly once every 6 years. As it posed an obvious question, why wasn't it seen in 1764 or 1758 at its previous returns? Well, when they did the maths and they worked out where it had been, it turned out that Comet Lexil 3 years earlier, when it had been furthest from the sun, had come very close to Jupiter. And Jupiter's gravity had essentially flung it our way. Before that encounter, the comet was coming nowhere near the inner solar system, probably moving on a really extreme elongated orbit way beyond Jupiter, but Jupiter grabbed it and threw it at the Earth, causing this near miss. So that's part of the story. But the other thing is, as everybody will know, we don't see Comet Lexil nowadays. It would be bright enough that we'd look up and every 6 years it'd be obvious in the sky. So what happened? Well, it turns out that 6 years, which is how long the comet took to go around the sun, is half of 12 years, which is how long it takes Jupiter to go around the Sun. So Comet Lexil went round twice, and as it got back to its furthest point from the Sun, Jupiter was there ready, waiting for it. And this time Jupiter's gravity grabbed hold of it and flung it out of the solar system, never to return. So the comet only crossed the Earth's orbit a couple of times. Initially it was flung inwards by Jupiter, giving us a very near miss. Then it was flung outwards again, never to return. And it's the balance of those two things that it really epitomizes Jupiter's role in this.
I guess it begs the question, we started off by talking about the extinction of dinosaurs and how that is believed to be some sort of asteroid impact on Earth. Is there a real chance of something like that happening again? Or is the science that we're using now and that we're going to be using over the next 5, 10, 20 years going to help actually prevent another one of those events from happening?
Depends on the timescale. If you took humanity out of the equation, the Earth will be hit again. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we are still a target in a shooting gallery. These things cross our orbit still all the time, and it's only a matter of time until one runs into us. Now, that's not to say you should be running around looking up and panicking all the time. People have done a calculation. Something 1 kilometre across, on average, would only hit the Earth about every 300,000 years, on average. Now, they're like buses. You wait a million years and 3 come along at once. But it's long time scales we're talking about here, particularly for the big threatening events. And certainly we don't know of any that pose a threat in the immediate future. But the Earth will be hit again. Fortunately, though, we've become a spacefaring race. We've developed technology that allows us to go into space, to visit these space rocks, to visit these comets, to land on them and to bring pieces back. And that's a really important first step in the process of actually being able to deflect them. We're the first species in the history of the Earth that we know of that understands the threat and is in a position to do something about it. And we're at the hoary edge at the minute. The technology is very new, but we're getting to the point where if we did discover something that was going to hit the Earth, that posed a legitimate threat and was discovered far enough in advance, we would have the wherewithal to do something about it and take our destiny into our own hands. We're not quite there yet, but we're almost there.
Professor, what sort of innovation are we likely to see, or do we need to see, to enable us to get to that point where we can actually deflect asteroids and protect the Earth?
We are moving that way. We've had fabulous missions by both the Japanese and the Americans that have visited asteroids and brought samples back. And that demonstrates the ability for us to get up close and personal with these things, to know exactly where they are and to manipulate them. And if you can manipulate them, if you can pick bits up and throw them off into space, the asteroid will recoil. So that's a step in the right direction. There's a mission currently in space called the DART mission, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, where the Americans are going to fire a fairly hefty lump of metal, a few hundred kilos, at the moon of an asteroid, a little thing called Didymos, to see what happens. And that 500 kilo, say, block of metal is going to hit it at 7 kilometers a second, give it a real wallop. And that should change the speed of that asteroid by less than a millimeter per second. But by changing its speed by less than a millimeter a second over hours and weeks and months, the position will be so different to what it would have been that it could affect a hit and take it and make it a miss. So that's the kind of technology people are looking at short term. In the longer term, there's a lot of discussion about the possibility of off-Earth mining, of going to asteroids, of extracting resources and sending the resources back to Earth. And this is seen as a way of getting things that we need on Earth in a more environmentally conscious way, among other things. Getting the rare earths that are scarce on the surface of the Earth, making people a lot of money in the process, of course. What often isn't discussed about it, though, is it does actually have a role to play in this concept of protecting the Earth from impacts, because it's exactly the same technology you need to move asteroids around. You see, if you dig up pieces of asteroids commercially to send those pieces back to Earth, you're going to fire them off into space. Now, if you do that, the asteroid will recoil. So what you're essentially doing is turning the asteroid into a very slow-moving rocket that you can push around. And so it's one of these weird situations where the development of new technology and the innovation involved in that, on the one hand, will lead to significant commercial advantage for some companies. They'll mine these asteroids, they'll make a lot of money. But on the other hand, will actually play an important role in giving us the ability to manage our own destiny and to move these asteroids around to turn, like I say, a potential hit into a definite miss.
Professor, it has been a real pleasure to have you with us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thanks for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
JONTI Horner, Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Southern Queensland, with us there.